You're the last human being on Earth. That's not metaphorical, not a thought experiment, not something to worry about right now. In reality, you're not the last human because you exist, but your species came perilously close to that moment. Somewhere in the deep past, when the world was radically different, when the climate was shifting in ways that made survival nearly impossible, your entire ancestral lineage was reduced to almost nothing. We're talking about a catastrophe so complete that nearly everyone died. 99% of the population, gone. The remaining 1%, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 or just a few thousand people, had to carry the entire future of humanity forward. If even one group had died, if they'd been a little less lucky, if the climate had been slightly worse or lasted slightly longer, you wouldn't exist. None of us would. The human species would never have emerged. We'd be extinct like so many other creatures that didn't make it through. This didn't happen recently. It didn't happen during some historical period we can read about in books. It happened so long ago that everything before it has become shadows and mysteries and fragments of genetic code buried in your cells. It happened 900,000 years ago. And when you really sit with that number, when you let it sink in, when you think about the staggering improbability of your own existence, it's kind of humbling. Because you're the descendant of survivors of the worst catastrophe our species ever faced. You carry the genes of people who made it through when almost everyone else didn't. You're alive because the people you descended from refused to die when the world was actively trying to kill them. Now, if you're settling in to listen to this in bed, in the dark, maybe trying to drift off, that's exactly what I made this for. There's something deeply comforting about contemplating extinction events that happened hundreds of thousands of years ago. Unlike the urgent catastrophes of the modern world, this one is safely in the past. It's already happened. The outcome is known. We survived. And there's no timeline, no deadline, no news alert that's going to change what occurred 900,000 years ago. So get comfortable. Maybe subscribe if you want to hear more about these deep time mysteries. Leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from, what time it is where you are. I always check those, and it's fascinating seeing people settling in to sleep all across the world, all of us wondering about the same mysteries together. And let's talk about the moment when humanity was nearly erased from existence, when the world transformed into something barely inhabitable, and only the most determined, most lucky, most genetically resilient handful of our ancestors made it through. Picture this. It's 900,000 years ago. The planet is in the middle of what geologists call the Mid-Pleistocene Transition, and it's not subtle. Something fundamental is changing about Earth's climate, and it's changing fast. For hundreds of thousands of years before this point, the planet had settled into a pattern. Ice ages came and went according to a rhythm, a cycle that lasted roughly 40,000 years. Ice would advance and then retreat in this regular pulse. It was cold and warm and cold again, but it was predictable. 40,000 years of cold, then warming, then back to cold, a rhythm that life had learned to work around, that plants and animals had adapted to, that human ancestors had developed strategies to survive. But around 900,000 years ago, that pattern breaks down completely. The glacial cycles don't just repeat anymore, they get longer, much longer. Instead of 40,000 years between ice ages, there's now a 100,000-year cycle. That might not sound like much of a difference if you're just looking at the numbers, but for organisms living on this planet, for plants and animals that had adapted their entire life histories to the shorter cycles, it's catastrophic. Everything changes. The ice ages that come during the Mid-Pleistocene Transition aren't just longer, they're more intense. The glaciers advance further than they did before. The cold penetrates deeper into what used to be habitable territory. Ice sheets expand, sea levels drop. The whole planetary climate system shifts into a new, harsher mode. And here's where it gets really bad for early human ancestors living in Africa. The climate shift doesn't just bring cold to places that were already cold, it brings aridity, it brings drought. And not the kind of drought that lasts a year or even a decade, but droughts that last for hundreds of years, that persist through generations, that fundamentally transform the landscape. Across Africa, the monsoon patterns shift. The rains that had kept vast regions green and fertile start failing. The waters that had been reliable dry up or become unreliable. Grasslands shrink, forests recede, water becomes scarce, then scarcer, then nearly impossible to find. For human ancestors who had been flourishing in these regions, who had adapted over hundreds of thousands of years to the relatively stable climate of the earlier Pleistocene, who had developed technologies and strategies specifically for living in this environment, this was extinction. Pure and simple. The food sources they depended on started disappearing. The animals they hunted began dying off. The plants they gathered became harder to find. Populations that had grown steadily suddenly started shrinking. And it didn't happen over thousands of years with opportunities to gradually adapt. The climate data shows this was relatively rapid. Not overnight by geological standards, but fast enough that lifespans and generational shifts couldn't keep pace with the change. Within a few thousand years, human populations across Africa were in freefall. Here's what the genetic evidence tells us about the scale of this collapse. Researchers took samples from over 3,000 modern humans, people from Africa and across the world, comparing their DNA to look for patterns. They analysed the genetic patterns, looking at the mutations and variations, trying to trace those lineages backward in time like unwinding a DNA clock. They used sophisticated computational tools, mathematical models that can reconstruct population histories from genetic data. And what they found was shocking. The population of early human ancestors was reduced to somewhere around 1,280 breeding individuals. 1,280. Let that number sit with you for a moment. Not 1,280,000, not 1,280 million, 1,200. 180 people capable of reproducing. That's the size of a small town. A single neighbourhood could contain the entire breeding population of the human species at its lowest point. At the peak, before the collapse, there had been roughly 100,000. So approximately 99% of the population was gone. That's almost incomprehensible. Nearly everyone dead. And it wasn't a quick die-off followed by rapid recovery. The population stayed that small for about 117,000 years. That's more than 100,000 years of barely scraping by, barely surviving, maintaining populations so small that genetic diversity was plummeting, that inbreeding became a real problem, that random bad luck could wipe out an entire lineage. You can compare this to modern endangered species. A population of 1,280 breeding individuals would be considered critically endangered. Conservation biologists would look at those numbers and say, extinction is possible, maybe even likely. If you're a giant panda or a California condor and there are only 1,280 of you, your species is living on borrowed time. We'd be running breeding programs, trying desperately to increase numbers, accepting that diversity has been permanently lost. But our ancestors made it through. For over 100,000 years, they hung on despite population numbers that should have spelled extinction. And the reasons why they managed this, what traits they possessed, what luck or skill or innovation kept them alive, much of that remains a mystery because we don't have good fossil records from this period. We don't have detailed accounts of their lives. We don't have written records, obviously. What we have is genetic evidence of the catastrophe and the slow recovery afterward. The recovery itself tells an interesting story, but it's also a complex one. For 117,000 years, the population stayed tiny. People were barely hanging on, existing in whatever refuge zones they could find, wherever the environment was slightly less hostile, wherever they could scrape together enough food to survive. But then around 813,000 years ago, something changed. The climate started improving. The African drought eased. The monsoons returned more reliably. Food sources became available again. The environmental conditions that had been actively trying to kill everyone started becoming slightly less lethal. And at almost exactly the same time, the genetic evidence shows that the population started growing. Expansion began. Populations that had been isolated and shrunken for over 100,000 years, that had been stuck at rock bottom, began to recover their numbers. Slowly at first probably, then accelerating. The genetic evidence shows this expansion clearly, a shift from stagnation to growth, from barely surviving to actually flourishing again. And this expansion happened to coincide with something else significant. Humans started migrating out of Africa. As populations recovered and grew more stable, as life became less desperate, people began moving into Eurasia, finding routes northward, crossing into regions that would eventually be populated by all non-African humans alive today. The climate was still fluctuating, still unpredictable in many ways, but it had become survivable again, and humans took advantage. They moved out of Africa in what seems to have been a large-scale migration, driven perhaps by the success of the population recovery, driven perhaps by the desire to explore new territories now that survival was less precarious, driven perhaps by the simple fact that they had recovered enough numbers and stability to attempt such movement. Whatever the specific motivations, this diaspora out of Africa around 800,000 years ago can be directly linked to the recovery from the bottleneck. The population that had nearly gone extinct was now spreading to new continents, establishing populations in places that had never seen humans before, beginning the slow process of populating the entire world. Now you might be wondering exactly who these people were. What species experienced this near extinction? And here's where it gets murky, because the fossil record from this period is sparse. Probably because when your population is reduced to around 1,280 individuals, fewer of those individuals are going to die in conditions where they become fossilized. Fewer chances for bones to be preserved, for skeletons to be discovered millions of years later by paleontologists. The math is simple but frustrating. Fewer people existing means fewer bones that could potentially become fossils. And of the bones that do exist, only a tiny fraction will end up in conditions where fossilization can occur. Most will decay, be scavenged, scatter, and disappear. So by the time we get to the modern era, looking back hundreds of thousands of years, the fossil record from this period is fragmentary and sparse. The fossil record shows some presence of early humans in Africa and Eurasia during this period, but it's fragmentary and hard to interpret. We find scattered bones and tools, stone implements showing that people were there, but not enough to give us a clear picture of what these people were like. Were they tall or short? What did they eat? How did they organize their societies? How were they different from each other? We can't really answer these questions from the available evidence. Researchers have suggested several possibilities about what species survived the bottleneck. They might have been Homo erectus, the species that had been dominating Africa and Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years before the bottleneck. or possibly a transitional species between Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis, something we've never formally named because we don't have enough fossils to be sure it was a distinct species. Homo heidelbergensis emerged around 700,000 years ago, so it's possible that this species represents the descendants of the bottleneck survivors, the population that had recovered from near extinction and evolved into a new human species with different characteristics. But we can't be certain. The fossil evidence just isn't clear enough to definitively answer the question. What we do know from the genetic data is that whatever species experienced this bottleneck also appears to be ancestral to Homo heidelbergensis, and through various lineages, ancestral to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and ultimately to modern humans. So all of us, every human alive today, descends from that tiny population of 1,280 individuals. We're all products of the recovery, all carrying the genetic legacy of the survivors. Think about that for a moment. Every human being that's ever lived after the recovery happened has been descended from those survivors. The fossil record from the period around 900,000 years ago to about 650,000 years ago shows this interesting gap. It's not that there's no evidence of humans, but the evidence is sparse, scattered, hard to interpret. Fossils show up in various places: China, Kenya, Ethiopia, Italy, Spain, even the United Kingdom. People were present across multiple continents despite the small overall population. But the scarcity of remains makes it hard to understand what was happening in detail. Were these populations isolated from each other? Were they maintaining contact? Were they already diverging into different groups that would eventually become distinct species? We don't really know. The gap in the fossil record corresponds almost exactly to the timing of the genetic bottleneck, which makes sense. Small populations leave fewer fossils. But it also means we're missing crucial information about what was happening during this period, how people were living, what adaptations they were developing, what culture and technology was emerging. This is one of those historical gaps where the genetic evidence fills in a crucial piece of the story, but it also reveals how much we've lost. The details, the specifics, the day-to-day reality of surviving this catastrophe, all of that is gone. The environmental data from this period is quite clear though, and it paints a picture of genuine horror for anyone living at the time. The geological record shows that cooling began around 900,000 years ago. Not gradual cooling, but a shift that happened relatively quickly in geological terms. Ocean temperatures dropped significantly. Ice sheets expanded across the polar regions and down into lower latitudes. Sea levels fell as water got locked up in growing glaciers, draining water into the ice sheets. The Mediterranean dried out in some regions. In Africa, where our ancestors lived, the climate became significantly drier. Rainfall patterns changed fundamentally. What had been consistent wet seasons became increasingly unpredictable. Droughts lasted longer. The vegetation shifted in response. Forests shrank back. Grasslands expanded. And in that grassland expansion, the megafauna that humans had been hunting began to struggle. Large animals like mammoths and giant ground sloths depend on consistent vegetation patterns. They need the right plants available at the right times in sufficient quantities. When those patterns shift, when the plants they eat become scarce, populations decline rapidly. And when the megafauna declines, human populations dependent on hunting them decline too. It's not just about losing one food source, it's about cascade effects. It's a cascade of ecological change, each part affecting the next, creating a domino effect of collapse spreading through interconnected systems. This is the fundamental mechanism of how the bottleneck happened. The climate changed. The environment couldn't support the previous population. People died. Populations crashed. And only the populations that managed to find resources in the transformed landscape survived. The ones that were flexible, that could eat whatever was available, that could move to follow resources, that had the right mix of skills and luck and genetic fortune to make it through the worst years. Those were the ones who made it through, and they were remarkably few. The recovery seems to have been helped by several factors. As the climate began to stabilize somewhat around 813,000 years ago, food sources would have recovered gradually. But more importantly, this is the period when we start seeing increasing evidence of controlled fire use. The earliest clear evidence of humans using fire for cooking dates to around 780,000 years ago, mostly from sites in what's now Israel and the Levant region. But it's quite possible that fire use was developing during the recovery period itself. Fire would have been transformative for human survival. It would allow you to cook food, making it more nutritious and easier to digest. It would keep you warm through the cold periods. It would let you move into new regions, new climates that would have been impossible without fire. Fire would have allowed humans to expand their diet, to eat foods that required cooking to be edible. It would have increased available calories, allowed more people to survive on the same territory. The development and mastery of fire would have been crucial for the population recovery, and the timing is suggestive. Right as populations are beginning to rebound from the bottleneck, fire use is becoming more common. This isn't coincidence. The two are likely connected. Humans learned to use fire. Fire provided a survival advantage. The population recovered. What's perhaps most mysterious is how exactly people survived during the 117,000 years when the population was at its lowest. How did they maintain enough genetic diversity to avoid complete collapse due to inbreeding? Small populations face a serious problem called inbreeding depression, where the genetic diversity shrinks so much that harmful mutations start affecting more and more individuals. You'd think a population of 1,280 would rapidly decline into extinction from this alone. How did they preserve knowledge and culture across so many generations of extreme scarcity? In stable populations, elders teach the young, knowledge passes down, culture accumulates. But what happens when everyone is desperate, when people are scattered in small groups, when survival takes everything you have? How did scattered small groups manage to avoid extinction from random disasters, from disease outbreaks, from bad luck? A population of 1,280 breeding individuals sounds like 1,280 too few. You'd expect extinction, not survival. But they did make it. Perhaps different theories emerge about how this was possible. Maybe the survivors had specific adaptations, genetic or behavioral traits that gave them advantages in the harsh climate. Maybe they were smarter, or had better memory for plant knowledge, or could run faster to catch prey. Maybe they developed superior hunting techniques or gathering strategies that other groups didn't have, innovations that let them survive on less food. Maybe they had the cognitive flexibility to switch diets and adapt to new food sources faster than other populations, the kind of mental agility that lets you survive radical environmental change. Maybe they were geographically fortunate, living in refuge zones where conditions were slightly less harsh than elsewhere, places where water and food remained available even when most of Africa was drying up. Or maybe it was just extraordinary luck, survival against nearly impossible odds, one of those moments where history could have gone a completely different way but didn't, where the outcome hung in the balance for thousands of years. The studies don't tell us which. They just tell us it happened, that somehow these people made it through, that they found a way, that luck, skill, adaptation, something allowed them to survive when almost everyone else didn't. The implications of this bottleneck extend far beyond just the survival of the population itself. Genetic diversity was severely limited in ways we're still trying to fully understand. During the 117,000-year period of low population size, genetic variation that existed before the bottleneck was lost irretrievably. When you have a small population for a long time, a process called random genetic drift removes variation. Genes that don't directly affect survival can disappear just by chance, lost in the randomness of reproduction. Harmful mutations can become more common if they happen to exist in the surviving population. It's not selection, it's just bad luck. This reduction in genetic diversity has been suggested as possibly influencing human evolution itself in unexpected ways. Some researchers think that the bottleneck might have driven the evolution of certain traits that became characteristic of later human species, brain size for instance. After the bottleneck, human ancestors seem to have been evolving larger brains, developing what would eventually become the large human brain we have today. Perhaps the genetic restructuring that happened during the bottleneck, the selective pressures from the harsh environment, the small population effects where certain genes became overrepresented, all of this contributed to directing evolution toward increased brain size. Maybe the bottleneck didn't just thin out the population, it redirected human evolution. And then there's the chromosomal mystery, something even more fundamental. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 total. All other apes, including chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have 24 pairs, 48 total. That difference might not sound like much, but it's significant. At some point in our evolutionary history, two ancestral chromosomes fused to become what is now human chromosome 2, a massive chromosome containing hundreds of millions of DNA base pairs. This fusion changed our genetics fundamentally. It created reproductive incompatibility with other species that still had 24 chromosomes. Once your species had the fusion, you could no longer successfully breed with species that didn't. It was a speciation event, a moment when we became something different. And when did this fusion happen? The timing is consistent with the Mid-Pleistocene Transition and the bottleneck around 900,000 years ago. It's possible that this massive chromosomal reorganization happened during or shortly after the bottleneck, that the genetic restructuring of the population facilitated the fusion, that the small population size made the fixation of this novel chromosome combination easier. Smaller populations with the new chromosome could still succeed because they weren't competing with much larger populations of the old type. If so, then the bottleneck didn't just affect how many of us survived. It changed what we are genetically. It fundamentally altered human biology. We're not just descendants of those survivors. We're genetically different from everything that came before because of what happened to them. Now, all of this understanding comes from a remarkably recent discovery. The study was published in Science in 2023, just a couple years ago. Scientists using sophisticated genetic analysis tools took samples from thousands of living humans and analyzed their genomes in detail. They used new computational methods to trace population history backward in time, working through the genetic variations preserved in modern people to reconstruct what happened thousands of generations ago. They could see signatures of ancient bottlenecks written into DNA, patterns of genetic variation that revealed how populations had changed over hundreds of thousands of years. This technique is called FIT-COL, which stands for Fit Conditional Optimal Linear Model, a mouthful for something that's actually a relatus, very straightforward mathematical approach. It's a computational method that analyzes genetic data to detect population changes that happened millions of years ago by looking at the patterns of variation between and within modern populations. Before this tool was developed, scientists could see that humans must have experienced a bottleneck at some point. The genetic diversity of modern humans was suspiciously low compared to other primate populations, suggesting something had happened in our past to reduce it. But they couldn't pinpoint exactly when or how severe without better tools. Now they can. And what they found was a bottleneck far older and far more severe than previous estimates had suggested. The previous theories about human bottlenecks usually focused on more recent events, like the Toba supervolcano eruption about 74,000 years ago, which some researchers had suggested created a genetic bottleneck in human populations, nearly wiping us out. But this 900,000-year-old bottleneck is older and more extreme. It's a bigger mystery because it's more distant, less well documented, harder to understand in detail. Most of what we know about the world from 74,000 years ago is relatively recent history compared to 900,000 years ago. It's also more consequential because it happened at a critical point in human evolution, right when human ancestors were evolving from earlier forms into later forms, right when the foundation was being laid for all future human species, maybe even right when the chromosomal fusion that made us genetically distinct was occurring. The question that lingers is what exactly caused this catastrophe? The climate change seems clear. The Mid-Pleistocene Transition happened. The cooling is visible in the geological record. The drought in Africa is documented. These factors definitely created the conditions that made survival difficult. But what pushed the population down to such an extreme low? Was it purely the climate, or were there other factors? Some researchers suggest that other megafauna extinctions might have been crucial. If elephants or other large animals that humans hunted went extinct or dramatically declined during this period, that would have forced humans to find alternative food sources. That transition would have been difficult, might have killed many people before new strategies could be developed. Or may. Hype disease played a role. Small populations are vulnerable to epidemic disease, but disease also makes it harder for populations to recover. If an epidemic hit the already stressed population, it could have pushed numbers even lower. Or maybe human conflict played a role. When resources become scarce, when populations are stressed, competition between groups intensifies. Warfare might have killed many people, might have driven populations further down. We don't know. The genetic data tells us something happened that crashed the population. The environmental data suggests climate change was involved. But the exact mix of causes, the relative importance of different factors, that remains unclear. And that uncertainty is itself interesting, because it reminds us that even with sophisticated genetic tools, even with detailed paleoclimate data, there are aspects of ancient catastrophes that we simply can't reconstruct. The psychological significance of this bottleneck is worth considering too, worth sitting with. Our species nearly went extinct. We are the descendants of one of the most extreme population crashes in mammalian history. Every human being alive today carries the genetic legacy of that survival, the genes of people who made it through when almost everyone else didn't. Every single person, no matter where they're from, no matter what they look like, no matter their language or culture or beliefs, they all descend from the same tiny population of survivors. There's something that feels important about that, something that changes how you think about human resilience and human fragility at the same time. We are resilient enough that 1,280 individuals could eventually rebuild into billions, that such a catastrophically small population could recover and thrive. But we are also fragile enough that a climate shift could nearly wipe us out entirely. We depend on stable conditions, stable resources, And when those change rapidly, we can be devastated. We are powerful, but we're also vulnerable. And yet we survive. We adapted. We recovered. That's the story of humanity written into our genes, told in the language of our DNA. We nearly died, but we didn't. And because we didn't, everything that came after happened. All of human civilization, all of recorded history, all of culture and technology and art and everything we think of as humanity, all of it is the product of those 1,280 survivors who made it through the worst climate catastrophe our species ever faced. That's profound if you think about it. That's the kind of thing that might make you pause and just sit with the strangeness of existence for a moment. All the complexity of human history, all the achievements of human beings across the ages, all of it resting on the survival of a few thousand people during an ice age you've never heard of, in regions that looked completely different, facing challenges we can barely imagine, droughts that lasted for centuries, temperatures that dropped, food sources that disappeared, and they made it through, and now you're here, alive, listening to this in the dark, maybe drifting off to sleep, existing only because they made it through. That's either comforting or terrifying, or probably both at the same time. Your existence is improbable and contingent and miraculous. There's a particular kind of fear that only exists when you realize the numbers are real, not 1,280 as a dramatic phrase, not 99% as a headline, but 1,280 as an actual ceiling on the future, the limit on how much humanity could afford to lose before the story ended forever. Because once you get below a certain point, you don't just risk extinction from starvation or cold, you risk extinction from arithmetic, from genetics, from the simple fact that a species can't survive if it becomes too small for too long. And this is where the story gets even stranger. Because the number that shocked the world, the 1,280, doesn't mean what most people think it means. When geneticists talk about a population crash, they're not always talking about how many bodies existed at one time. They're talking about something colder and more abstract, something closer to what actually matters in evolution. They're talking about how many people effectively contributed to the next generation. It's called effective population size, NE, and it's not a head count. It's a measure of how many genetic voices are actually being heard. Because in a real population, not everyone reproduces. Some people die before they can, some can't, some never find partners, some lose children, some have one child, some have 6, some lineages explode, others vanish, and in harsh conditions, when food is scarce, when groups are isolated, when survival is uncertain, that inequality becomes extreme. Picture a world where you're not choosing mates based on romance or preference, but on who survived last year's drought, who has enough resources to support a child, who is healthy enough to carry a pregnancy, who is strong enough to hunt, who belongs to the group that controls the only reliable water source. In that kind of world, reproduction becomes concentrated, narrow, and the gene pool shrinks. Not because the population is literally 1,200 bodies, but because only a tiny fraction are successfully passing their genes on. So when scientists say the breeding population dropped to around 1,280, what they're saying is that the human species became genetically thin, a narrow funnel, a handful of lineages doing almost all the reproductive work for everyone else. And the longer that funnel lasts, the more it changes what humanity is. Because a population can survive short-term collapse. It can bounce back. It can regain numbers in a few good seasons. But if it stays small for 100,000 years, it becomes a different thing. Not just culturally, genetically, permanently. This is why the 117,000 years matters as much as the crash itself. A brief bottleneck is like holding your breath. A long bottleneck is like living underwater. Eventually, the organism adapts to the new reality, or it dies. So how do we know it lasted that long? How do you look at a modern human genome and see a disaster nearly 1 million years ago? The answer is that genes remember, even when bones don't. Your DNA isn't just a set of instructions, it's a record of survival. A messy record full of scribbles and edits and scars, but a record nonetheless. Every mutation in your genome is like a timestamp, a tiny mark that appeared in someone, somewhere, at some point in the past. And when you compare genomes across thousands of living humans, you can see patterns, not in the obvious traits like eye color, but in the deep structure of variation itself. Variation is the key. If a population is large, it can hold many variants at once, many branches, many lineages, many different versions of genes drifting around. If a population is small, variants disappear. Not necessarily because they're bad, they disappear because they're unlucky, because the person carrying them didn't have children, or because their children died, or because their group vanished in a drought. In a small population, chance becomes a weapon, and the genetic record shows what chance did to us. When geneticists reconstruct population history, they're essentially doing something like genealogical archaeology. They're taking modern genomes and tracing their ancestral lines backward, not as family trees with names, but as probabilistic lineages. If you trace any gene backward through time, it eventually converges. 2 copies of a gene in 2 different people will eventually meet at a common ancestor, the person whose gene got copied and passed down while others died out. In a big population, it takes a long time for lineages to converge because there are so many ancestors. In a small population, convergence happens fast because there are so few. That's the whole trick. A population crash creates a moment where many lineages die, leaving only a handful, and when you look at modern genetic variation, you see a signature of that narrowing. A stretch of time where the genealogy collapses quickly, where diversity stalls, where the genome becomes unusually uniform in ways that cannot be explained by ordinary drift alone. It's like looking at tree rings and seeing a year of drought, except the tree is your species. And this particular ring, the one around 900,000 years ago, looks like the tree nearly died. What makes this discovery so unsettling is that it's not one isolated signal. It shows up across the genome, across populations, across continents. It's not a myth. It's not a story passed down by oral tradition. It's a pattern too consistent to ignore. And once you accept that, you're forced into the next question. Where were they? If most of Africa became drier, if ecosystems collapsed, if the old rhythms broke, then what places remained livable? Because people did survive. Not one person, not a miraculous lone survivor carrying humanity on their back. A network of small groups, a scattered handful, a species reduced to embers, not extinguished. To survive a crisis like this, you need refuges, places where the world is slightly less hostile, places where water persists when rains fail, places where plants still grow, where animals still pass through, where humans can stay alive long enough for the climate to shift again. And the haunting thing is that we may never know exactly where those refuges were, because the landscapes have changed so much since then that the geography of survival has been erased. Rivers that existed then might not exist now. Lakes that provided water may have dried up long ago, coastlines have shifted, sediments have buried old habitats, tectonics have rearranged the ground itself. But we can make educated guesses, because Earth leaves its own traces. And when you begin to overlay climate reconstructions, fossil distributions, and the locations of early human sites, a few regions start to glow with possibility. One of the strongest candidates is the East African Rift System. The rift is more than a geological scar. It's a chain of highlands, valleys and lakes created by the slow pulling apart of tectonic plates. Over long periods, this creates varied microclimates. Rainfall patterns differ across short distances. Even when surrounding regions become dry, the rift can hold pockets of water. Large lakes act as reservoirs. Rivers fed by highland rain can continue to flow even during drought. And for early humans, water wasn't just something you drank. It was a map. Water meant plant life. Plant life meant herbivores. Herbivores meant meat, and meat meant survival. If you could find a place where water persisted, you didn't just find a drinking source. You found an entire ecosystem refusing to collapse. You found a refuge. Another candidate is highland regions, places where elevation created cooler, wetter conditions than the lowlands. In times of widespread aridity, highlands can become lifeboats, cloud forests, springs, different vegetation patterns. The Ethiopian highlands, for example, have long been a climatic anomaly in East Africa, capturing moisture and sustaining rivers that feed large regions. It's possible that small groups survived along these upland corridors, moving between patches of stable water and edible plants, living in a world where the lowlands became dangerous emptiness. Then there are the coasts. Coastlines are tricky in deep time because sea levels move dramatically during glacial cycles, but coastal refuges offer something extraordinary: predictable food. When inland resources collapse, the ocean does not stop producing. Shellfish, fish, seaweed, marine mammals, birds. If humans learned to exploit marine resources early enough, coastal living could have provided a stable base during periods of inland drought. This is one of the most important points about human adaptability. It isn't just about making better tools. It's about changing your relationship to the world, changing what you consider edible, changing what habitat you consider home. A species that can switch ecosystems can survive when others die. But coastal evidence is hard to find, because the coasts of 900,000 years ago are now underwater. Entire campsites, tool scatters, burial places, all submerged beneath modern seas. So even if coastal refuges were crucial, much of the archaeological proof would be erased. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means the sea swallowed the evidence. And the fourth refuge possibility is river corridors. When a region dries, rivers become lifelines. People cluster around them. Animals cluster around them. The landscape compresses toward water. River valleys can maintain vegetation corridors even in dry climates, creating narrow green strips through otherwise hostile terrain. If you imagine the population collapsing, you can imagine humans retreating into these corridors, moving along water as if following veins across the continent. This might have created exactly the kind of isolation and fragmentation that makes effective population size plummet. Small groups cut off from each other by expanding arid zones. Refuges separated by hundreds of kilometers of dryness. Occasional contact when climate oscillations created brief windows of connectivity. And that dynamic, fragmentation with rare reconnection, matches what genetics often sees in deep time populations, long periods of isolation punctuated by pulses of gene flow. So the bottleneck might not have been a single isolated camp of 1,200 people huddled in one valley. It might have been dozens of small groups scattered across a continent, each one hanging on, each one vulnerable, each one representing a precious fraction of the future. This is a more realistic picture, and it makes the survival even more impressive, because it means humanity survived not as a single line, but as a fragile network, a network that could have broken at any point. Now consider what life would have felt like inside that network. Not the heroic version, not the dramatic version, the slow, grinding version. Survival over 100,000 years doesn't look like one spectacular battle against nature. It looks like thousands of small decisions repeated in the same harsh conditions, generation after generation. It looks like children growing up never knowing a world that was easier. It looks like elders dying with knowledge that might not fully pass on. It looks like constant movement, constant calculation, constant awareness of water, of food, of predators. And in that world, the strategies that matter are not the ones that make you powerful. They are the ones that make you flexible. This is where technology comes in, but not as a sudden invention, more like a slow sharpening of habits. If you already have stone tools, they become more important when food is scarce. Every calorie matters, every cut of meat matters, every plant you can process matters. Tools become survival amplifiers. They allow you to extract more from less. And this is one of the most underrated forces in human evolution: extraction. Humans are not always the best hunters, not the strongest, not the fastest, but humans are extraordinary extractors. We can take a carcass and turn it into food more efficiently than most predators because we can cut, scrape, and separate. We can take a tough root and turn it into edible starch by pounding, slicing, cooking. We can take a landscape that looks barren and find small resources hidden in it. Extraction is what allows a species to survive scarcity. So during a bottleneck, the populations that survive are the ones that extract best. That doesn't necessarily mean they have radically different tools. It can mean they use the same tools more intelligently, more consistently. It can mean their culture carries knowledge about where to find hidden resources, how to process them, which plants are safe, which are dangerous, which are only safe after certain preparation. This kind of knowledge does not fossilize easily, but it can be the difference between extinction and survival. And then there is fire. Fire is so obvious to us that we forget how miraculous it is. The ability to create heat at will, to convert inedible food into edible food, to extend your day beyond sunset, to keep predators at a distance, to survive colder nights, to dry wet materials, to harden wooden tools, to smoke meat. Fire is a technology that changes the rules, but fire is also fragile. It must be maintained. It must be protected. It can be lost. So early fire use likely wasn't about striking sparks and making flames from nothing every time. It may have been about carrying embers, keeping coals alive, transporting fire between camps, and this creates a powerful image. Imagine a group travelling across a dry landscape carrying their fire in a clay-lined hollow, or a bundle of slow-burning material, treating it like a living thing, guarding it like a child, because losing it could mean death. Fire becomes not just a tool, but a companion. And during long droughts, fire becomes even more crucial because it allows you to make use of marginal foods. Cooking expands diet. It increases calorie access. It reduces chewing time. It makes certain toxins manageable. In harsh conditions, even small improvements in energy efficiency can keep a population alive. This is the kind of advantage that doesn't look dramatic in one lifetime but becomes decisive over thousands of years. So the bottleneck survivors may have been the groups who were best at keeping fire, not because fire was newly invented necessarily, but because their cultural habits preserved it through difficult periods, because they had routines, practices, social roles, someone whose job was to maintain embers, someone who knew which materials burned slowly, someone who knew how to build a windbreak, someone who could coax flame from the last glow when everything else was damp or exhausted. And this brings us to the most important survival technology of all, not tools, not fire, but cooperation. A lone human does not survive 100,000 years of environmental stress. A group might, and even then, only if it shares. This is uncomfortable to admit because we like to imagine early humans as purely competitive, purely brutal. But the genetic evidence of survival implies something else. It implies that humans were capable of maintaining social bonds even in extreme scarcity. Because in scarcity, selfishness can destroy the group. If every individual hoards, the weak die quickly. Children die. Knowledge dies. The group loses resilience. The group fragments. But if food is shared, if children are supported, if injured individuals are carried or protected, the group retains its continuity. And continuity is everything in a bottleneck. 117,000 years means thousands of generations. The only way to sustain anything across that span is through culture. Culture is memory that outlives individuals. Culture is the true survival technology. And in a bottleneck, culture becomes brutally important because the margin of error is razor thin. A single mistake can wipe out a lineage. A single drought can kill a group. A single disease can sweep through a small community and leave nothing. So the groups that survive are the ones whose cultural practices reduce risk. And what reduces risk? Mobility, knowing when to move, knowledge of water sources across large territories, redundancy, multiple food strategies, not one, social support, sharing, cooperative child rearing, and something else that becomes crucial in small populations, connection. Even if groups are isolated, they cannot stay isolated forever. A population of 1,200 breeding individuals spread across a continent needs occasional gene flow, occasional mixing. Otherwise, the genetic load becomes too heavy. So the survivors likely had some mechanism, intentional or accidental, for reconnecting. Maybe seasonal gatherings at reliable water sources. Maybe migrations that brought groups into contact. Maybe trading relationships. Maybe conflict followed by absorption. However it happened enough to keep humanity from collapsing genetically, which suggests a haunting possibility. Even during the worst period, humans might not have been completely scattered strangers. They might have maintained a fragile network of connection, and that network could be the true reason we survived. Now, if you step back, you start to see the bottleneck not as one disaster, but as a long era of filtered survival, an era that acted like a sieve. And the sieve doesn't just decide who lives, it decides what traits the future humanity will have, because the survivors become the template. This is where the idea of genetic loss becomes more than an abstract concept. Imagine the pre-bottleneck humanity as a broad library of genetic variation, many different versions of genes, many different physical tendencies, perhaps different tolerances to heat and cold, different immune variations, different metabolic adaptations, different cognitive inclinations. You can't know exactly what was there, but you can know that it was broader than what survived. Then the bottleneck happens and the library burns. Not completely, but enough that most books are gone. The surviving shelves are what you inherit, and you never know what you lost. You never even know the titles. You only feel the emptiness as a lack of diversity, a narrowness in the human genome that scientists notice when they compare us to other species. Humans are genetically less diverse than you might expect for a global species of billions. There are reasons for that, including more recent bottlenecks, migrations, founder effects. But this deep bottleneck could have been one of the biggest reasons. It might explain why humans feel genetically like a species that has been squeezed, because we were. And the squeezing may have had consequences beyond diversity. It may have shaped the trajectory of human evolution itself. This is where things get speculative, but in a controlled way, the kind of speculation that science itself entertains as possibility, not as certainty. Some researchers have suggested that after the bottleneck, the human lineage shows signs of major transitions. Not instant, not magical, but visible in the broad arc. Larger brains, different body proportions, more complex behaviors, eventually the emergence of new species like Homo heidelbergensis. If a bottleneck filters a population, it can do something paradoxical. It can remove variability, yes, but it can also allow rare traits to become common. In a large population, a novel mutation might stay rare for a long time. In a small population, chance can elevate it quickly. A trait that might have been drowned in the gene pool can suddenly become a defining feature if the individuals carrying it happen to be among the survivors. This is why bottlenecks are dangerous and transformative. They are extinction engines, but they are also evolutionary accelerators. They can reshape a lineage in a way that a stable population would resist. And this leads directly into one of the strangest pieces of human biology, chromosome 2. At some point, the human lineage underwent a chromosomal fusion that no other living ape shares. 2 ancestral chromosomes fused into one. That fusion is visible in your genome. The evidence is literally there. Telomere-like sequences in the middle of chromosome 2, remnants of where the fusion occurred. It's like a seam in the fabric. This fusion is not a small mutation, it's a structural rewrite. And structural rewrites can create reproductive barriers, making populations incompatible, pushing speciation. So the timing matters. If the fusion happened in a small bottlenecked population, it would have had a better chance of becoming fixed, of spreading through the entire group, simply because the group was small enough that one genetic change could sweep through. In a massive, diverse population, such a fusion might be diluted, remain rare, or fail because of reproductive disadvantages. In a small, constrained population, the calculus changes. A weird thing can become normal. It doesn't even have to be strongly beneficial. It just has to survive. And if it survives long enough, it becomes the species. This is why the bottleneck might not have been just a survival story. It might have been a turning point, a narrow bridge across which a new kind of human walked, leaving older versions behind. If that sounds dramatic, that's because it is, but it's also how evolution works. Not with grand announcements, but with quiet, irreversible shifts that only become obvious when you look back. So now we're standing at the edge of the next phase of the story. We have the crash, we have the long survival, we have the idea of refuges, of tiny groups keeping fire alive and sharing food and moving through a drying continent. We have the genetic scars. And we have the possibility that something fundamental changed in our biology during this era. The next question is what happens when the world eases its grip? Because eventually it did. The climate didn't stay permanently catastrophic. It shifted again, as it always does. Rain patterns improved, habitats reopened, corridors formed, and the survivors, those scattered embers of humanity, began to expand. But expansion is not just population growth. It's collision, it's reconnection, it's migration, it's mixing. And when isolated groups meet after tens of thousands of years, something powerful happens. Cultures exchange, genes exchange, ideas spread, and the human story changes pace. You can feel the momentum beginning, even this far back. A species that spent 100,000 years barely surviving does not expand gently. It expands like something released, like pressure unsealed, like a lineage that has been held down by climate and suddenly finds space to breathe. And that expansion, that release, is where the next layer of mystery begins. When pressure releases after being held for that long, the effects are rarely subtle. The survivors didn't simply refill empty landscapes, they transformed them. Slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, as if the human lineage itself had been coiled tight by scarcity and was now unspooling across a world that had finally stopped trying to erase it. But expansion after a bottleneck doesn't look like a clean restart. It's uneven, fragmented, messy. Because the people who emerged from those refuge zones were not a single unified population marching outward together. They were dozens, maybe hundreds, of small groups that had been isolated for generations. Each group carried a slightly different subset of the surviving genetic library. Each group had its own habits, its own adaptations, its own cultural memory shaped by the specific refuge it had endured. So when the climate eased and corridors reopened, humanity didn't expand as one thing. It expanded as many things, reconnecting. And reconnection changes everything. Imagine two groups meeting after tens of thousands of years apart. They look similar enough to recognize each other as human, but different enough to feel unfamiliar. They may have different tool styles, different ways of organizing camps, different diets, different ideas about territory and sharing, different vocal patterns, maybe even early proto-languages that had drifted apart. That first contact would have been cautious, curious, possibly hostile, possibly cooperative. But regardless of how it began, contact meant exchange of genes, exchange of ideas, exchange of survival strategies. And that exchange is one of the most powerful accelerators in human evolution. Because isolation creates difference, but connection creates complexity. This is where the story transitions from survival to transformation. After the bottleneck, human populations didn't just grow, they diversified rapidly. We start seeing clearer regional patterns in the fossil and archaeological record, differences in body proportions, differences in tool industries, differences in how people used landscapes. This is not coincidence. It's the signature of a population that has been fragmented, squeezed, and then released. A released population explores. A released population experiments. A released population adapts quickly because the world is no longer uniformly hostile, but unevenly permissive. Some regions recover faster than others. Some ecosystems bounce back earlier. Some corridors open briefly and then close again with the next climatic oscillation. So human movement becomes dynamic, pulsed, opportunistic. And here's the crucial point. This is not yet modern humans as we imagine them. This is still deep prehistory, still hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens appears, still a world dominated by earlier human forms, often grouped under names like Homo heidelbergensis, archaic Homo, transitional populations whose exact classification scientists still debate. But these people are already doing something recognizably human. They are responding to opportunity. They are moving when movement becomes possible. They are testing environments. They are spreading risk. And that behavior, more than any single mutation, is what allowed humanity to escape the bottleneck permanently. Because once populations spread across multiple regions, extinction becomes harder. A drought can kill one group, but not all. A cold snap can wipe out a valley, but not a continent. Diversity of location becomes a shield. This is why migration is not just a story of curiosity or adventure. It's a survival strategy written into our deep history, and after 900,000 years ago, migration becomes one of the defining features of human existence. The archaeological record begins to show this more clearly around 700 to 800,000 years ago. Stone tools appear in places where earlier populations could not have survived during the worst of the bottleneck. Northern latitudes, higher elevations, regions that would have been lethal without improved technology and social organization. This tells us something important. The survivors didn't just wait for the world to become easy again. They pushed. They used the margin they were given. They expanded into newly available niches as soon as conditions allowed, and that expansion required more than strength. It required planning. It required foresight. It required group coordination. This is where we start seeing stronger evidence for hunting strategies that go beyond opportunism. Evidence of systematic butchery. Evidence of cooperative hunting. Evidence that people were not just scavenging what they found, but actively shaping their food acquisition. That matters because hunting large animals is not an individual skill. It's a group skill. You don't bring down large prey without communication, timing, and shared intent. And those things require minds that can model the behavior of others. They require anticipation. They require memory. In other words, they require cognition. This is one reason why many researchers believe the post-bottleneck period was crucial for cognitive evolution. Not because brains suddenly doubled in size overnight, but because the selective environment favored individuals who could function well in groups under dynamic conditions. When survival depends on coordination, the ability to read others becomes as important as physical strength. When resources are patchy and seasonal, memory and planning matter. When groups meet and exchange, social intelligence becomes decisive. The bottleneck didn't just kill people, it reshaped what kind of people could succeed afterward. And this reshaping is visible in the fossil record, even if the record is sparse. Skull morphology begins to change, brain cases gradually expand, faces become flatter, teeth change in size and shape, reflecting dietary shifts. These are slow changes, but they cluster around the period after the bottleneck, suggesting a lineage emerging from extreme constraint and then diversifying under new pressures. One of the most striking developments during this time is the increasing geographic spread of human populations across Eurasia. By around 700,000 years ago, humans are clearly established in Europe and East Asia. Sites in Spain, Italy, China, and Java show repeated occupation. These are not brief incursions, they are sustained presences. This means that the descendants of the bottleneck survivors did something extraordinary. They didn't just recover, they conquered climate. They learned to live in environments radically different from the African landscapes where earlier humans had evolved. Cold winters, seasonal food scarcity, different predators, different plants, different rhythms of light and dark. Surviving in these regions required behavioral flexibility, clothing, even if rudimentary, shelter construction, fire management, food storage, or at least food scheduling. This is not trivial. And it suggests that by this point, humans were no longer merely reacting to environments, they were actively engineering their relationship with them. But here's the unsettling part. All of this innovation, all of this expansion, all of this complexity rests on a genetic foundation that has been severely narrowed, which means that the humanity spreading across the world at this time was not as diverse as earlier humanity might have been. They were variations on a theme, not an orchestra, and that has consequences. One consequence is that when these expanding populations encountered each other again, the differences were enough to create tension, but not enough to prevent interbreeding. Which brings us to one of the most important outcomes of the post-bottleneck world, the branching of the human family tree. As populations expanded into different regions and remained there for long periods, they began to diverge, not instantly, not cleanly, but gradually in ways that become visible when you look at the deep structure of human ancestry. This is where Neanderthals enter the story, and Denisovans, and other archaic humans we barely understand. These groups did not appear out of nowhere. They are the products of expansion, isolation, adaptation, and reconnection. The bottleneck survivors gave rise to a lineage that spread across Africa and Eurasia. Over time, parts of that lineage adapted to specific regions. In Europe and Western Asia, colder climates and seasonal extremes shaped a population that would eventually be recognized as Neanderthals. In parts of Asia, other populations adapted in different ways, giving rise to Denisovans and possibly other groups we haven't yet identified clearly. In Africa, populations continue to evolve along their own trajectories, eventually giving rise to Homo sapiens. But here's the crucial thing. These were not separate creations. They were branches of the same recovery, all of them trace back to that near-extinction. Which means the bottleneck didn't just precede human diversity, it enabled it. By forcing humanity through a narrow gate and then allowing expansion, the bottleneck created conditions where divergence could happen quickly once the pressure eased. Small populations expand into different environments. Different environments favor different traits. Isolation allows those traits to accumulate. Reconnection allows partial mixing. The result is a braided river of human evolution, not a straight line. And this braided structure is why human ancestry is so complex. It's why modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA. It's why Denisovan genes show up in populations in Asia and Oceania. It's why there is no clean boundary between species in deep human history, only gradients and overlaps. All of this complexity emerges downstream of the bottleneck, but it also carries its scars. One of those scars is genetic vulnerability. Low diversity populations can carry hidden weaknesses. When diversity is lost, certain deleterious mutations can become fixed. Others can increase in frequency. Some of these mutations may have had little effect in the short term, but long-term consequences. Modern humans show surprisingly high frequencies of certain genetic disorders compared to other primates. Some researchers have suggested that ancient bottlenecks, including this one, may be part of the reason. The genome we inherited was already constrained, already shaped by survival rather than optimization. We're not the best possible human. We are the human that made it through. That distinction matters, because it reframes how we think about human exceptionalism. We're not the inevitable pinnacle of evolution. We're the contingent outcome of survival under extreme constraint. If the climate had been slightly worse, if the drought had lasted slightly longer, if one refuge had failed, if one critical lineage had died, the human story would have ended before it truly began. And that knowledge lingers, even if we don't consciously think about it. It lingers in our psychology, our deep anxiety about scarcity, our obsession with resources, our instinct to migrate when conditions deteriorate, our tendency to form groups and identify outsiders, our remarkable ability to adapt quickly to new environments. These are not cultural quirks, they are echoes of a time when adaptability was not an advantage but a requirement. Now consider something else that often gets overlooked. A bottleneck of this magnitude doesn't just reduce genetic diversity, it also compresses time. In evolutionary terms, it creates a reset point. Everything before becomes less relevant. Everything after builds on a narrow base. This means that many traits we consider ancient may actually be relatively recent. Not recent in historical terms, but recent relative to the full span of human evolution. Traits like extended childhood, high social tolerance, complex communication, even aspects of human emotional regulation. These may have been refined or amplified after the bottleneck, not before. Because in small populations under stress, traits that reduce conflict and enhance cooperation can be strongly favored. A group that tears itself apart cannot survive long-term scarcity. A group that manages tension, shares resources, and maintains cohesion stands a better chance. This doesn't mean early humans were peaceful or gentle. It means that groups that balanced aggression with cooperation survived better than groups that didn't. And over tens of thousands of years, that balance can shape psychology. Which brings us to an uncomfortable thought. Some of the things we struggle with today, our sensitivity to stress, our tendency toward anxiety, our deep concern with social belonging, may not be bugs. They may be features. Traits that kept small groups alive when the world was hostile. Traits that become overwhelming in a modern world that no longer resembles the conditions they evolved for. The bottleneck didn't just filter genes, it filtered minds, and those minds became the ancestors of all later humans. As populations expanded and diversified, these psychological tendencies spread with them, modified by culture but rooted in deep evolutionary history. So when you feel a sense of unease in uncertain times, when scarcity triggers fear, when isolation feels unbearable, you are not weak. You are remembering something your species learned the hard way. Now, as the post-bottleneck world continued to open, humanity entered a long phase of expansion, divergence, and reconnection that would last hundreds of thousands of years. This is the phase where the human family becomes complicated, where multiple human forms coexist, where different lineages meet, compete, interbreed, and sometimes replace each other. And all of that complexity is downstream of a moment when extinction nearly won. Which means that every later chapter, Neanderthals, Denisovans, modern humans, migrations, art, language, civilization, is written in the shadow of that catastrophe. The near-extinction is not a footnote, it is the hinge. Everything that follows depends on it. And the next part of the story is not about survival anymore, it's about what happens when survivors become dominant. When a lineage that learned to endure begins to reshape the planet, when adaptation turns into expansion, when flexibility becomes power, that's where the real transformation begins. As survivors became dominant, the world itself began to feel smaller. Not because the planet changed, but because humans did. Movement became easier. Knowledge accumulated instead of being lost. Groups remembered routes, seasons, refuges. Fire was no longer a miracle when it appeared, but a tool that could be carried, maintained, controlled. Landscapes that once represented death became navigable. Valleys that had been avoided became corridors. Mountains became challenges instead of walls. This is the phase where humanity stops merely reacting and starts anticipating. And anticipation changes everything. Because once you can anticipate the future, even imperfectly, you're no longer bound to the present moment. You can store food, you can plan routes, you can delay gratification, you can choose when to move instead of being forced to move. This is not a sudden revolution. It unfolds slowly, unevenly, across thousands of years. But the trend is unmistakable. The post-bottleneck human lineage begins to show something new. Temporal depth. Not just memory of the past, but awareness of the future. You see it in toolkits that anticipate multiple uses. Hand axes shaped not for one task but for many. You see it in hunting strategies that involve driving prey toward locations prepared in advance. You see it in site reuse. Camps returned to season after season, generation after generation. This suggests that humans were no longer living entirely hand-to-mouth. They were thinking ahead. And thinking ahead creates feedback loops. A group that anticipates can survive lean periods better. That survival allows more children. More children preserve knowledge. More preserved knowledge improves anticipation. This is how small advantages compound. This is how recovery accelerates. By around 600,000 years ago, human populations had reached a point where extinction from a single environmental shift became far less likely. Not impossible, but less likely. The species had spread across too many regions. It had diversified too much. It had learned too many ways to survive. From this point onward, human history becomes a story not of near extinction, but of competition. Competition with environments, competition with other species, competition with other humans, and that competition would shape everything that followed. One of the most consequential outcomes of post-bottleneck expansion was the emergence of regional human forms that were adapted to very specific conditions. This is where the idea of archaic humans becomes important, not as failed experiments, not as evolutionary dead ends, but as successful specialists. Neanderthals are the most famous example. They did not emerge because humans were becoming smarter in some linear way. They emerged because a population adapted extremely well to a particular niche. Cold, seasonal Europe, short growing seasons, large herbivores, long winters, low sunlight. Neanderthal bodies reflect this environment perfectly. Stocky builds, short limbs, large nasal cavities, high muscle mass. These are not primitive traits. They are optimized traits. Neanderthals were endurance specialists in cold environments. They were not less intelligent than modern humans. Their brains were as large as ours, sometimes larger. Their cognition was tuned differently, not inferior. They lived in small groups. They hunted dangerous animals at close range. They maintained fire. They cared for injured group members. Some individuals survived severe injuries for years, which only makes sense if others supported them. That level of care requires social bonds. It requires empathy. It requires cooperation. And it requires a stable enough group structure to sustain non-productive members. This is not a species barely surviving. This is a species thriving in a hard world. Denisovans, though far more mysterious, appear to represent another branch of this post-bottleneck diversification. We know them almost entirely from DNA and a handful of fossils. But their genetic legacy is enormous. Modern populations in parts of Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan genes that confer high-altitude adaptation, immune advantages and other traits. This tells us Denisovans were not marginal. They were widespread. They were successful. They adapted to environments modern humans initially struggled with, and they did it independently. All of these human forms, Neanderthals, Denisovans, early Homo sapiens, are products of the same recovery. They are siblings, not ancestors and descendants. They share a common bottleneck in the deep past, which means that the bottleneck didn't create one future, it created many, and those futures would later collide. When Homo sapiens finally emerges as a distinct population in Africa around 300,000 years ago, it does not enter an empty world. It enters a world already inhabited by other humans. Humans who have been adapting to their environments for hundreds of thousands of years. Humans who know their territories intimately. Humans who have their own cultures, technologies, and social systems. This is crucial to understand. Because Homo sapiens did not spread across the world, because it was the only human, It spread because it was one human among many, and something about its strategy allowed it to eventually dominate. That strategy likely involved a combination of factors: greater social network size, more flexible communication, stronger long-distance alliances, higher tolerance for strangers, more fluid group identities. These traits would allow sapiens groups to absorb others, exchange ideas, and recover from losses more effectively. In a world shaped by bottlenecks and recoveries, resilience matters more than raw strength. And resilience often comes from connection. This is where the story becomes less about genes and more about behavior. Because behavior scales. A group that can coordinate across distances can outcompete a group that cannot. A group that can integrate outsiders can grow faster than a group that remains insular. A group that can transmit information efficiently can adapt faster than one that relies on individual learning alone. These advantages don't require superior intelligence. They require social architecture. And social architecture is shaped by history. A lineage that survived near extinction by fragmenting into small groups and then reconnecting may be especially good at reconnecting, especially good at rebuilding networks, especially good at surviving disruption. In other words, the bottleneck may have selected not just for adaptability, but for reconnection, and that trait would later define Homo sapiens. This doesn't mean sapiens were peaceful. It means they were effective. They could form coalitions. They could negotiate. They could outlast. And in a long competition, outlasting matters. Over tens of thousands of years, sapiens populations expand out of Africa. They encounter Neanderthals. They encounter Denisovans. They interbreed. They exchange genes. They sometimes replace. They sometimes absorb. And slowly, the human landscape simplifies. Not because diversity was never there, but because one strategy proved more scalable than others. This process is often misunderstood as a sudden replacement. In reality, it was uneven, prolonged, and region-specific. Neanderthals disappear from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago, but their genes remain. Denisovans disappear even earlier in some regions, but their genetic legacy persists in modern populations. This means extinction was not absolute, it was transformation. The human lineage did not eliminate all others, it incorporated parts of them, which again echoes the bottleneck, survival through integration. Now consider something quietly remarkable. Despite all this mixing, despite all this complexity, modern humans are genetically remarkably similar to one another, much more similar than you would expect given our global distribution. Two humans from opposite sides of the planet are genetically closer to each other than two chimpanzees from neighboring forests. This is not normal for a species with our range, and it points back once again to the bottleneck. When your species passes through a narrow gate, it carries that narrowness forward. Even after expansion, even after diversification, the deep structure remains. This is why race is a poor biological concept. Human variation exists, but it is shallow. It reflects recent adaptation, not deep separation. All modern humans share a recent common ancestry compared to many other species, and that recent common ancestry is anchored in the recovery from near extinction. This has profound implications. It means that every human conflict, every division we create, is happening within a population that was once reduced to a few thousand individuals. It means that all of our differences emerged after a moment when difference nearly vanished entirely. It means that our diversity is recent, fragile, and contingent, and it means that our unity is older and deeper than we usually acknowledge. The bottleneck didn't just shape our biology, it shaped our relationship to each other. Now zoom out even further. Think about the planet itself during this time. The Mid-Pleistocene Transition was not a one-time event. It marked the beginning of a new climatic regime. Longer glacial cycles, more extreme swings, greater instability. This is the world in which humanity matured, not a stable Eden, not a gentle nursery, but a volatile system that repeatedly tested survival. This matters because it means that instability is not an anomaly in human history, it is the norm. We did not evolve in a predictable world. We evolved in a world that changed faster than bodies could adapt, which means behavior had to compensate. Flexibility had to replace specialization. Learning had to replace instinct. Culture had to replace genetics as the primary adaptive mechanism. And culture evolves orders of magnitude faster than genes. This is why human evolution appears to accelerate after the bottleneck, not because mutation rates increased, but because cultural evolution began to dominate. Tools change faster than bodies. Social systems change faster than skull shapes. Knowledge accumulates faster than genes. Once that shift happens, extinction becomes less likely, but new risks emerge. Because culture can overshoot, it can create dependencies, it can create fragility. The very systems that protect us can become vulnerabilities, and this is where the bottleneck becomes more than ancient history. It becomes a warning. Our ancestors survived a world that became unlivable, but they did so by remaining flexible, by not overcommitting to a single strategy, by maintaining mobility, by distributing risk. Modern civilization has done the opposite. We have centralized, we have specialized, we have built systems that require constant stability. This doesn't mean collapse is inevitable, but it means that the lesson of the bottleneck still matters. Adaptability matters more than optimization. Redundancy matters more than efficiency. Connection matters more than dominance. The survivors of 900,000 years ago didn't know they were saving the future. They were just trying to make it through the next dry season, the next winter, the next loss, and yet everything we are traces back to them. Not because they were exceptional heroes, but because they endured. And endurance, in the end, is what evolution rewards. The next part of this story is not about the past, it's about the pattern, about how often this has happened, about whether extinction bottlenecks are rare or common in human history, and about what happens when a species that survived one near erasure begins to test the limits of its environment again. Because the forces that almost erased us once have not disappeared, they have only changed form. At some point, endurance stops being invisible. For hundreds of thousands of years, survival leaves no monuments, no cities, no writing, no names, just continuity. Just the fact that the line does not end, that children are born, that knowledge passes imperfectly but persistently from one generation to the next, that when the world turns hostile, someone still wakes up the next morning. But eventually endurance accumulates into something recognizable. It becomes momentum, and momentum changes the scale of history. After the bottleneck, after recovery, after dispersion, humanity enters a phase where extinction is no longer the default outcome of crisis. This does not mean safety. It means buffering. It means that disasters no longer threaten the entire species at once. They threaten regions, populations, cultures, but not everyone simultaneously. This is the critical transition. Before this point, one bad century could end everything. After this point, humanity becomes distributed, and distribution is survival. Populations spread across Africa, Eurasia, and eventually into environments so extreme that no previous human lineage had occupied them. Deserts, high-altitude plateaus, frozen steppe, tropical forests dense enough to block sunlight. each expansion is not just a movement of bodies, but a movement of solutions. Fire management changes in cold zones. Water storage becomes critical in arid zones. Toolkits diversify depending on prey, terrain, and season. Knowledge becomes localized. But the ability to share knowledge remains global, and that is the quiet superpower of Homo sapiens. Not intelligence in isolation, not strength, but transmission, information that survives its originator. A hunting technique that works once is useful. A hunting technique that can be taught is transformative. This is where culture overtakes biology completely. Genetic evolution continues, but it becomes background noise compared to behavioral change. And this is why the post-bottleneck world accelerates. Because solutions don't have to be reinvented every generation. They can be inherited, not through DNA, through memory, through imitation, through teaching, through story. Story may be the most underestimated survival technology in human history. A story can encode when to migrate, where water appears after rain, which plants kill and which heal, which animals migrate and when, which paths are safe, which are cursed. A story does not require understanding to be effective, it only requires belief. And belief, when tied to survival, becomes powerful. This is likely why symbolic behavior becomes more visible after the bottleneck. Not because humans suddenly became artistic, but because meaning became useful. Ritual stabilizes groups. Shared beliefs reduce conflict. Symbols compress information. A painted mark on a cave wall may represent far more than decoration. It may represent territory, or memory, or warning, or identity. And identity matters when populations grow large enough that not everyone knows each other personally. This is another post-bottleneck development. Group size increases, not dramatically at first, but enough to require new social tools. Kinship alone is no longer sufficient. You need mechanisms to trust non-kin. You need rules. You need norms. You need shared narratives. These are not abstract developments. They are survival adaptations. A group that fractures internally during stress is less likely to survive than one that holds together. And cohesion is not automatic. It must be built, maintained, reinforced. Over tens of thousands of years, humans become experts at this, which is why later societies can scale to hundreds, then thousands, then millions. But that capacity was forged when numbers were small and survival was uncertain. The bottleneck didn't just reduce numbers, it selected for cohesion. Now consider the irony. A species that nearly went extinct because the environment changed too fast eventually becomes a species that changes the environment faster than it can adapt. This is not a coincidence, it is a trajectory. Once culture replaces genetics as the primary adaptive mechanism, feedback loops shorten. Actions have consequences faster. Innovations propagate quicker. Impacts accumulate. Agriculture is the clearest example. It emerges independently in multiple regions long after the bottleneck. Not because humans suddenly became clever, but because population density crossed a threshold. Mobility decreased, resource pressure increased, and cultivation became more reliable than foraging. Agriculture is often framed as progress, but in evolutionary terms it is a trade-off. It produces more calories, but it reduces dietary diversity. It increases population size, but it increases disease. It creates surplus, but it creates hierarchy. It stabilizes food supply, but it destabilizes ecosystems. From an extinction perspective, agriculture is both protective and dangerous. Protective because it supports large populations. Dangerous because it creates dependencies. A farming society cannot easily revert to foraging. It becomes locked into its system, and locked systems are vulnerable to shocks. crop failure, climate change, soil depletion, water scarcity. History is full of agricultural collapses, but none of them erased humanity entirely, because humanity was no longer a single system, it was many. This is the lasting legacy of the bottleneck. Redundancy through dispersion. When one system fails, others persist. But redundancy is not infinite. The modern world is doing something unprecedented. It is reconnecting humanity into a single system again. Global supply chains, shared climate, interdependent economies, technological synchronization. This is not inherently bad, but it reintroduces a risk profile that humanity has not faced since the bottleneck. Global vulnerability. A shock that propagates everywhere, a failure that cannot be localized. This doesn't mean we're on the brink of extinction, but it does mean that the ancient lesson matters. Resilience comes from diversity, from redundancy, from decentralization, from the ability to absorb loss without collapse. The survivors of 900,000 years ago didn't know these principles consciously. They embodied them. They survived because they were scattered, because they were flexible, because no single failure ended everything. Which brings us back to the present moment. You're not the last human on Earth, but you are part of a lineage that remembers what it means to almost be. Your genome carries that memory, not as trauma, but as structure, the narrowness of variation, the echoes of selection, the signs of recovery. Every human alive today is a statistical improbability stacked on top of another, a species that survived when it shouldn't have, that expanded when it was weakest, that diversified when it was most constrained, that learned to store survival outside the body, in tools, in fire, in stories, in each other. Extinction is not a singular event, it is a process, and survival is not guaranteed by strength, it is maintained by adaptability, by cooperation, by remembering that existence itself is contingent. The bottleneck was not the end of humanity's story, it was the narrowing that made everything else possible. If the population had been larger, evolution might have taken a different path. If the climate shift had been slightly harsher, the line might have ended. If one refuge had failed, you would not be here. And yet, against those odds, the line continued, quietly, patiently, until it became loud enough to reshape the planet. As you drift towards sleep, consider this. You are not just alive by chance. You're alive because thousands of generations refused to vanish, because a handful of people endured a world that wanted them gone, because survival, once achieved, was never forgotten. The world almost ended for us once. It did not succeed. And the fact that you are here, breathing, listening, thinking, resting, is proof that extinction was not inevitable. It was resisted, and that resistance echoes forward, through you, through everyone, into whatever comes next. So rest. The story does not end here. It never has.